This video covers the information from our unit chapter on the 20th century and after. You can find that from pages 959 through 982 in our Norton textbook. And I'm really kind of covering the big ideas. I think a lot of what this chapter does is kind of give very specific examples to support the topic sentences throughout the chapter, to support the main claims about this time period, to support the main claims about the poetry and the fiction and the drama. And so I'm really kind of just touching on the big things here. The textbook has so many specifics and really delves so much more into the writing of the time, and I think that that's sort of a testament to how vast and broad good writing became. I guess what I mean by that is not only were we finding excellent authors published from wealthy families in London, we were also finding excellent authors published from low-class families, from foreigners or people who are marginalized, people who didn't have a voice before. So there's just so much to read about and so much to talk about, and our textbook doesn't cover everything. Even some of the wonderful authors our textbook references, they're not actually included in the readings in our book. So there's just so much great stuff out there that, especially, I mean, this period is from 1901 until right now. So the longest period of time that we've talked about so far. One of the things I always like to do at the beginning of this video is to kind of define modernism. Here we're looking at the end of aestheticism, and I think that, just to kind of pause for a second, I think that right now the text is encapsulating a very broad definition, because even as literary critics and critics of, like, historical critics have dug into the specifics of this 20th century and after, we're looking at modernism, postmodernism, postcolonialism. I feel as if there might be even another word that I'm unfamiliar with to define very most recently contemporary texts. So our textbook, I think, just clumps a whole lot of stuff together that probably shouldn't all be clumped together. Okay, so here we have definitions of sort of like this, what's coming after, what is in the 20th century. So we have the end of aestheticism, where the aesthetic movement kind of disconnected writers from the general public. You had your poets and your authors, and they kind of existed on this one plane, and everybody else just sort of, in a sense, worshipped them, almost as if they were like our modern day celebrities. And so because of that, aestheticism sort of alienated people from art, and that feeling of alienation is partly what helps to define modernism. You'll notice in some of the texts that I've selected for us to read this unit that there's a lot of disillusionment, this feeling that the promises of the past really weren't upheld today, and how our authors are dealing with that, and if they're blaming people, if they're just accepting it, and this sort of like stoicism that's happening. And so the end of aestheticism, the aesthetic movement, kind of helps to define this era that we're looking at. But I think even more so, historically, the Victorian period ended, and here we are in modernism. But there are some, and I'm going to talk about this a little later on, there are some other ways in which we can define subsets of this time period. And so again, I feel like really our textbook could, if it wanted to be this specific, organize this chapter, this unit, into at least 3 smaller sections, if not 5. And the other thing I think that really helps to clarify all of the ideas in this chapter, all of the things that make the most sense to me in understanding the modernist and postmodernist movements, is really just kind of how society and culture is changing. Modernity disrupts the order of the Victorian period. You know, we have like this class distinction that is accepted and makes sense for the people at the time period, and all of those, like, people are questioning this, and it's causing disruptions in, you know, how things are supposed to be. The status quo is really being called into question, and ethical and social codes, and, you know, what is acceptable, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate. All of these, we're really getting this very gray area, and our authors are tapping into that and, like, I want to say violently yanking it out of society. And what I mean is just our writers during this time don't care about what things are supposed to be. They don't care about making sure the reader still feels comfortable with these ideas. They are pushing the boundaries, crossing the boundaries, really just essentially eliminating the boundaries altogether. And so I think because we see that here, particularly in the later end of this period, 1950s and on, that's, I think, helps to really define the texts that we're looking at. And so just really everything is being questioned, and that's kind of what the first part of this chapter is going to talk about. Some of the things that kind of, I think, help to either clarify the time period or maybe even help give another subset of this 20th century and after is all of the technological advancements. And we talked about technological advancements in the Victorian period and how, you know, the steam engine and just electricity and time, all of these things were kind of booming, and factories and production and stuff like that. We have another version of that here. So in 1901, we get the first wireless communication. In 1903, the Wright brothers, hello North Carolina, fly an airplane, and the Model T becomes the first mass-produced car in 1913. There's this mass production of gramophones and canned goods, and all of this sort of capitalist consumerism, everybody gets one, is an interesting thing that's happening here, because a lot of our writers are criticizing this concept of mass production. And I think that we can, in a sense, understand that and relate to that in the same sense that today, like, people would criticize big box stores because it puts the uniqueness of sort of that little mom and pop shop or whatever, gets rid of that, or it makes, while it makes that still unique, people don't care about that. People aren't supporting that anymore. And I think that that is similar to the type of criticism of these sort of new mass-produced items. But also in the same sense, there is this criticism of newness and why it's necessary. It's almost like, in the same sense, our textbook talks about tech for tech's sake is being criticized in the same way that we're getting away from aestheticism. Our writers, our thinkers, our philosophers are saying, you know, why are we doing this? Is it really good for us? So there's this booming excitement and an underbelly criticism of it. It's an interesting thing to see and watch happen. And you'll see it and you'll see this disillusionment from our writers, because they're saying, you think all of these things are what we need, and you think all of these things are what are going to make us happy, but in the end, we're all mortal. And so when I said before that part of this period might need to be further defined. Our textbook does talk a little bit about that. So we have a couple of mentions of Edwardian and Georgian, and these are sort of post-Victorian labels for different time periods. And I'm mostly quoting from the book here when I give you this information. So the Edwardian period is right after the Victorian age, and it's where the social and economic, and I'm reading mostly from this slide, the social and economic stabilities of the Victorian age remained unimpaired, meaning they're still intact, they're still together, but we can sense this ideological change, this desire for need for freedom. Freedom from government, freedom from the traditional force, freedom from the Victorian ideal, and so in all of the things that covered. So economically, we still have the Victorian aesthetic. We still have that definition of the social classes and the distinction between the social classes and what is etiquetely appropriate, and how to live life in that way. The middle class is flourishing. There's still that hierarchy of class, but it's like you can feel the change. There's something happening here. Change is coming, and you can feel it. And if you really think about it, I imagine that in some facet of your life, things have been normal, and I'm putting that in air quotes, but things have been the way that they've always been, but something is going to change, and there is this uneasiness and this anxiety almost, and so that's what defines, or that's how we can help to define Edwardian and that label. And then post that, we also have this Georgian label, which our textbook calls the lull before the storm of World War I. And here I think we're looking at the storm as post-war disillusionment. All of these people in the world we're looking at in Europe, they have to ask themselves, how do we get here? Because the post-war disillusionment is, I thought growing up that life was going to be the way that life was for my parents. And now life is not that way for me. My ideal, the illusion that I created for my future, what I thought it was going to be naturally, right? Normally, that makes sense. I don't get that. And that's that post-war disillusionment because things have changed now and things are different, and we can't go back to the way it was. And that famous quote from whoever wrote it, and I should know this because I'm an English teacher, but you can never go home again. And I think that's the feeling expressed in the Georgian period is, that's the feeling that's going to be expressed after. So this is the lull before the storm. There's gonna be this post-war disillusionment, and it's that really super happy period right before everything breaks. It is that part. They are living their best life and they're illusioned, and it's about to kind of shatter. So these are some other labels that we can look at as well in helping understand what's going on in the textbook. Some other notable items that your textbook, again, goes into more detail than I will here, is I'm just calling this a list of liberation dates. So essentially, your textbook will talk about the collapse of the British Empire. I believe that this is what it's referencing. So just kind of when, at one point, English rule was so massive. I think our textbook says it ruled like a third of the world. I'm not sure. But just, it was really big. And there's only been a handful of countries that England didn't at some point rule over in some way, whether it was colonies or part of the British Commonwealth. But through the period of up right before 1950, almost into 1980, particularly in the 60s, a lot of stuff was happening regarding independence from British rule. Here we have a list of, I'm looking at maybe 10 to 15 different places that were freed from British rule. Some of these places remained in the British Commonwealth. Here's just a list. Our textbook writes it out in different ways and kind of jumps back and forth, but this is a chronological list of the countries that, kind of left or liberated from England and England's rule, or all of the British rule, I guess I should say. Some other things before I get into really kind of the literature of the time period, or just some notable politics. And in 1979, Margaret Thatcher becomes the first female prime minister in 1979. So what is that? I'm really bad at math. What is that, 40 years ago? And then from 1979 to 1997, the UK has, well, England and UK's constituents has a conservative government. So for almost 20 years, during this time period, those who didn't support the conservative government felt that more conservative policies was actually widening the gaps between rich and poor, black and white, north and south, England, and the other countries that British rule was over. And so, but for quite a big chunk of time, there was a conservative government. Late in the 60s, the Irish Republican Army fought to unify Ireland outside of British rule. So part of Ireland was independent from the UK. Okay, I could be wrong about this. This is my understanding of what I was reading in the text. I'm not really a history person. And so what they wanted to do was to unify all of Ireland, to bring it all back together, but to separate completely from British rule. They didn't want to be a part of that. So that kind of was backtracking a little bit. Once the Conservative government was out of office in 1997, the Labour Party ruled. I really don't know the differences between the Labour Party and like our more liberal party in the United States, but I sense some overlap. Again, I am not, while I am not a history person, I'm also not a politics person, so I'm really not sure about that. So in that instance, we have Tony Blair followed by Gordon Brown ruling under the Labour Party, so a different form of government, a different party. Similar to how we have like our Republicans and Democrats, we have conservative government, the Labour Party here in England. And then in 2010, David Cameron wins, who you may have heard his name because 2010 was only 9 years ago. And that took the British government back to the Conservative Party. Currently, our book isn't talking about this, but Theresa May is the woman who's the current Prime Minister of England. And she is still part of the Conservative Party. So right now, there's a conservative government there. So things to know. I don't know how much. I think that if you were going to use this information to really help build a foundation for understanding the text, that's phenomenal. You can absolutely take a political, historical approach to reading a text. You just have to kind of remember, like, when was this text published and where did the author live and what was going on politically at the time. There's a lot of things to consider, and there's a lot of controversy in all sorts of facets of the world. So it's something that would definitely make for significant writing. It's just a lot to push into your brain. All right, so the next 3 slides, I'm just covering kind of big ticket items: poetry, fiction, drama. Again, like I said at the beginning of this video, the textbook uses a lot of examples to talk about the movements and the ideals on writing and things like that. So I am glazing over a whole bunch of it. In this unit, I think I've said this as well, the pretty much half of the reading is on the literature of the time, which is very unlike our past couple of readings. So while I have kind of always just quickly gone through the literature portion of the introduction, even though all of it's really about literature, but the actual specific types of writing I've gone through super quick in the past. I'm also going through them quickly here, but certainly pay attention to this in your book because it covers about half of the content. So in poetry, we have the Imagist movement, and our textbook essentially says that this movement is getting away from all of that, I like to call it fluffiness of poetry, the stuff that I honestly really don't like about poetry. It's fascinating. I'm teaching this class because I don't love poetry, and yet I find the majority of things that we're reading is poetry. And so here these writers and these poets are saying we need to be as clear and concise about our subject matter as possible. And this is kind of happening around the 1910s into the 1920s, almost up until the 30s. And in conjunction with this is metaphysical poetry, which is not new. This is pulling from like the romantic, pre-romantic, 17th century poetry, a lot of irony, a lot of wit. Now, our modernist writers are going to look at irony in a completely different way, in my opinion, from how this sort of like Renaissance 17th century style poetry is being done. They're looking at irony in a way, it's almost like dark irony. And so in this, they're also looking at wit. There's a lot of incorporation of puns, which our textbook mentions that it had been 200 years since it was acceptable to write a pun in poetry. And that's so interesting to me because I think puns are hilarious. So this metaphysical poetry used irony and wit to offer a clear, colloquial, so sort of like conversational language, and maybe even slang-based poetry that the Imagist movement demanded. So if the Imagist movement is saying, we want really clearly worded language, we don't want all that flowery fluff of, say, the Romantics, we want specific and concise things. And I feel like, of course we're talking about British lit here, but one of the American authors that I've always felt like encompasses this concept and clarity, maybe it's ambiguous, but just in writing in a way that's like, okay, there it is William Carlos Williams, and a really phenomenal poem that if you need an example of this, again, it's American lit, is The Red Wheelbarrow. So just go read it. It's like 3 lines. But it is just crisp, and this is my subject matter, and here we are talking about this thing, and everybody knows what we're talking about. And yet we can use a lot of really interesting figures of speech, like the pun, to make it interesting and to not make it so bland. And then we have this other thing that our textbook talks about, which is not called any type of movement. It is a group of people that's just called the movement. These people believe in what the Imagist movement is doing, but even more so. So not only is everything in poetry have to be clearly worded, but even more than before. Like the clear words we had at the beginning of this century were not enough. The movement, again, this group of people who's they're just demanding even more clear writing, possibly in saying they might not even want those metaphors and those similes that would have been acceptable in the early part of the century. So in fiction, we see kind of these 3 subsets of modern novels. We have the 1920s high modernism, the 30s through the 50s, the reaction against modernism, and then in the 60s, we have the period after the collapse of the British Empire. And our textbook, after it lists out these 3 subsets, it really, again, exemplifies what it's talking about by digging into various authors. High modernism, so this would be the first subset of modernist novels, here you're talking about fiction books that are published, is celebrating personal and textual inwardness, complexity, and difficulty. What this means is these authors they no longer felt that there was one unified reality that everyone experienced, and there was a turn in writing toward the unreliable narrator, toward what you perceive is what is real. So I think our current my truth concept, where it's like, this is true for me, it might not be true for you, but it's true for me. I think that that's very much derived from this part of modernism. So again, we're looking at like analyzing consciousness in our textbooks. The narrator becomes such a key player. No longer do we have narrators that just know everything and we can trust them. We're really getting away from that in modernism, and possibly even more so, or maybe even a reversal in postmodernism. Moving on to the next bullet, from the 30s to the 50s, this reaction against modernism. It's kind of like, okay, we tried that thing out, this high modernism, we didn't really like it, we want to go back to this is what's real, here's the documentary. But I think that it's not a complete and total reversal. It's an incorporation of consciousness and realism, and that we can look at all different types of things we haven't looked at before. I think so, like going back to the traditionalist texts, Victorian texts, where we had that one authorial voice. They're not really doing that in so much as the one authorial voice can only be a particular type of narrator, or even a particular class of person, race of person, whatever. We might have this return to realism, but we still have an extremely broad, conscious perspective to pull from, and we're going to see all sorts of authors kind of fitting in, finding a voice for themselves and for marginalized people, and figuring out how to fit all of that in. And then we have the period after the collapse of the British Empire. So again, we've got all of, like I said before, we have all these marginalized voices, and they're still talking about what's real for them. But they're also talking about language and form and meaning. And again, our text is going to exemplify that in a number of ways. Feminism, queer voices, people who lived under British rule, but their country is no longer under British rule. So we have just a ton of voices flooding the market, so to speak, with these novels. And then finally, our text talks about drama, which is interesting because it spends more time than it ever has on drama, and it has the most to say about it. I really think, again, it's exemplary in the fact that exemplary might not be the right word here. It uses exemplification to support these ideas, and I think that there's two statements the text makes, one in the beginning and one at the end of this section, and I think both of these highlight all of the examples here. Our text talks a lot about Samuel Beckett, who worked really, really hard to make sure that traditional drama wasn't the only thing people had to go to in like the British theater. So what I mean by that is all of this other drama that was happening outside of London, in other countries, and in other places, and not right in the heart of the whatever the Broadway version is of London. I'm sure I should know this, but I don't. There was all of this traditionalism still going on up until like the 50s or the 60s in Europe, or in England, and Samuel Beckett worked to, particularly with this first quote that I'm going to read to you and talk about, to make sure that these other voices were brought in, and to kind of like intertwine and incorporate the weird stuff that was going on with drama during the modern period into the traditional drama we saw, the traditional plays, the traditional theater, because they just didn't want to give it up. Okay, so the first quote that our textbook says on page 978, over time the desire to unsettle, to shock, even to alienate the audience became one hallmark of modern drama. And so the text just goes in and provides a number of supporting examples that show how the playwrights and the cast members worked really, really hard to kind of make their audiences feel uncomfortable on purpose. And this is characteristic of the modern period. I mean, the goal here is to shake the status quo, and drama's absolutely doing that. The second, and this is the last, I think the last sentence in the entire chapter, the century that began with its first great dramatic movement in Ireland was followed by a century that began with English language drama more diverse in its accents and styles, more international in its bearings and vision than ever before. And so again, we are getting these plays are coming in, they're shaking up this traditional theater that we're used to and giving us all the voices, giving us every voice that we can imagine. I mean, maybe not every single one, but as many voices as there are that exist who want to write plays. And again, this is characteristic of the modern period. And so we, before we get people at the top of the social class who are either writing about their issues or the things that they love or other people's issues and advocating for them. But in the modern period, we get everyone with the opportunity to maybe advocate for themselves, but also just to present their own reality and to analyze the reality then. Thus, if we have all of these different perspectives, how are we forced to rethink what we thought we knew? And I think that is all characteristic of modernism and postmodernism and all the things that our textbook kind of lumps into this chapter called the 20th century and after. So hopefully some of that makes sense. Please read the chapter. If I don't think I covered everything in the quiz here in this lecture, so you got to read the chapter. But if you have questions, if I've blundered over anything, which wouldn't surprise me at all, certainly let me know about that. Otherwise, you guys have a good week.